Almost 3,000 years ago, a civilization emerged in what we now call Italy that stood out from its neighbouring cultures on the Apennine Peninsula. This remarkable group of people eventually became known as the Etruscans. Imagine central Italy in the 8th century BCE. Rome, founded by the Latins, was becoming ever more powerful. Other Italic groups, the Aqui, the Sabines, the Volsci, the Hernici, amongst others, were all vying for control and trying to stay relevant. Meanwhile, groups of Greek settlers had colonized much of southern Italy and Sicily, with the region they inhabited often referred to as Magna Graecia, meaning Greater Greece. That sounds like quite the cultural mix, doesn't it? And it was. So what made the Etruscans so different to everybody else? Well, firstly, they were pretty sophisticated. They had incredible metalworking skills, they built huge stone and earthen mounds for burials, and they created incredible art. Secondly, they had interesting cultural norms that attracted the attention of ancient writers. It seems that Etruscan women had more of an equal footing to men than Greek and Roman women did. Thirdly, and probably strangest of all, they spoke a non-Indo-European language, whereas the Italic groups and the Greek settlers spoke Indo-European ones. All of this has baffled scholars over the years. According to the media, experts are always baffled or sometimes perplexed. The uniqueness of the Etruscans and their language makes the geographic origin of them somewhat of a mystery. And modern scholars aren't the only ones to be baffled. Ancient writers were also very confused about the Etruscans. So where did they come from? Perhaps DNA has the answer. This video would be incredibly long if I detailed the entire history of the Etruscans. However, since I'm talking about their geographic origins, certain aspects of their culture and history are important because they set the context and they also explain why the issue has been under the spotlight for so long. So I'm only going to include things that are relevant to this particular discussion. I've put chapters in case you want to skip around the different topics or get straight to the DNA data. The culture that would become known as Etruscan first appeared in central Italy in 900 BCE. This civilization stretched across modern Tuscany as well as parts of Umbria and Lazio. Called Etruria, this region expanded as the fortunes of the Etruscans grew, reaching its maximum extent in 500 BCE. Over the next 500 years, Rome curtailed the power of the Etruscans, and as with other groups on the peninsula, they eventually became absorbed into the Roman Empire by 27 BCE. The Etruscans wrote their language with a system derived from the Euboea alphabet that was in use at the time in Magna Graecia to the south. Here is an example. These gold plates are known as the Pergi tablets and are a dedication that was made at a temple at the Etruscan coastal site of Pergi near Rome. The temple was dedicated to the Phoenician goddess Astarte, as written on the left in Phoenician, as well as the Etruscan goddess Uni, as written on the tablets in the middle and the right in Etruscan. In spite of this bilingual inscription, Etruscan hasn't been fully deciphered yet, but the general consensus is that it was a non-Indo-European relict language using the Greek Euboean alphabet. Euboean was one of the many archaic Greek alphabets that existed before standardization in 400 BCE and is also the predecessor of the Latin alphabet that was eventually used by the Romans. The Greek alphabet wasn't the only outside influence on Etruscan culture. The 8th century BCE is considered the beginning of the Orientalizing period, when Egyptian, Phoenician, and Assyrian art started to have an influence on the Mediterranean, especially on the Greek, Roman, and Etruscan worlds. This is why there is such a strong similarity between cultural artifacts from ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan sites. One way in which the Etruscans were heavily influenced by Eastern Mediterranean art was how they depicted people in frescoes on the walls of their tombs. People often misconstrue these influences as proving an Eastern origin for the Etruscans, but it was simply the result of artistic styles spreading across the Mediterranean. That is why it's important to understand the trade routes and cultural connections that were taking place at the time. Things need to be considered in context. Several of the largest Etruscan cities are thought to have been Velch, Caesarea, Toshuna, and Fofluna. Between 600 and 500 BCE, 12 city-states made up a confederation called the Etruscan League, but it's not clear exactly which cities were included in this. However, in spite of this control over a huge territory, none of these cities have the extensive ruins of ancient Rome or other Roman cities and towns that left behind temples, theatres, bathhouses, markets, and many other buildings that made up the urban landscape. In fact, a lot of Etruscan cities were built upon by the Romans, so some archaeological sites have a mixture of the two, but are by and large Roman. For example, at Rucellai, these city walls are Etruscan, but the amphitheatre, mosaics, shops and temple are Roman. There's also part of an Etruscan city wall left at Vulci, but much of the rest of the visible ruins on this archaeological site are Roman. Most of what we know about the Etruscans comes from their tombs. These changed architecturally over the years and mostly consisted of underground stone chambers carved and decorated to look like houses and then covered with huge earthen mounds. This is the necropolis of Banditace near Rome. I've been there, but I struggled to find any photos amongst my own collection or online that encapsulated the magnitude of the site. It's a really big site and a lot of it hasn't been excavated. You walk for several kilometers past tons of tombs to get to the part that is open to the public. That is if you parked in the nearby town of Cemetery rather than the extensive car park at the site. I did that because I visited the museum at the castle first, where there are lots of Etruscan artifacts, and then thought a couple of centimeters on the map didn't look like a long walk, but it was a long walk. That said, I really enjoyed it because I got to see all of the area that hasn't been excavated yet. There's just tombs sticking out all over the place along this tree-lined road. It's very impressive. Inside the tombs, you see the structural details, which include carved stone to imitate wooden beams and pillars. It's thought these were meant to depict the houses of the Etruscans, even though none of these have survived in the cities, so I suppose we can't really be sure. The two neighbouring necropoli of Banditace and Monterozzi near Rome cover more than 300 hectares and contain thousands of tombs. Many artifacts were also recovered from excavations of these necropoli, which tell us a lot about the families interred in them. Look at this beautiful gold bracelet. Not all tombs are decorated, but those that are include frescoes and carved reliefs that are very elaborate. This tomb is known as the Tomb of the Reliefs and belonged to a family called Matuna. Etruscan women, mostly in the elite classes, got a lot of heat from ancient writers because they were allowed to socialize with men and drink wine. This was not standard in the Greco-Roman world, especially for wealthy women. High-class prostitutes were the exception. So ancient writers assumed that Etruscan women must also be sexually promiscuous. However, this does not appear to have been the case, with monogamous marriages being celebrated as the norm. That said, they do appear to have had more rights and more power than ancient Greek and Roman women, even retaining their names after marriage and passing them down to their children alongside that of their husbands. The Etruscans were also known for their divination skills, a practice that the ancient Romans adopted. A haruspex would practice divination by inspecting the entrails of sacrificed animals. For a long time, the Romans hired Etruscans specifically to do this. So as you can see, the Etruscans had certain skills and practices that made them stand out. A lot of outside influences did come from the rest of the Mediterranean during the Orientalizing period, and they used a Greek alphabet, but they also displayed certain cultural attributes that were quite particular. Now let's look at the etymology of the word Etruscan, because people often use etymology to try to explain the geographic origin of the Etruscans. The Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote that the Etruscans called themselves Resena, related to their word for people. In the dialect of Attic Greek, they were referred to as the Tyrrhenians, well, the Greek word for that, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. The Romans then used this to name the Tyrrhenian Sea. However, the term Tyrrhenian was also used for other non-Greek people as well. The Romans called them the Tasci or the Etrusci, which is why we now call them the Etruscans. Since the area they lived in, Etruria, covered a lot of modern-day Tuscany, that is how that region got its name. Where the terms Tyrrhenian and Tusci originally came from isn't certain, but they could have been related to the Greek and Latin words for tower. This implies that they built towers or that their walled, hilltop towns looked like towers. However, as I said, not much in the way of Etruscan architecture has survived. We learn a lot about it from their tombs, many of which were decorated to look like domestic dwellings. As far as I know, none of these look like towers, so if their name originates in the word for tower, I'm not sure why. But this is where people get carried away and say that they may have been related to the Bronze Age Nuragic culture in Sardinia, who built thousands of towers called nuraghe. That idea isn't even in the running though, by the way. It's one of the more random ones that I've come across and has no substance to it at all. So what did the ancient writers say about the Etruscans? Some ancient writers placed the Etruscans' origins in the Aegean. Others thought that they were native to the Italian peninsula. Some were convinced they were pirates, and another theory placed their homeland in the Alps. Now, this isn't an exhaustive overview of the subject, but let's look at a few good examples. Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote, "Indeed, those probably come nearest to the truth who declare that the nation migrated from nowhere else, but was native to the country, since it is found to be a very ancient nation, and to agree with no other either in its language or in its manner of living." So basically, what he is saying is that the Etruscans were native to Italy and had been there longer than the waves of migrants that settled on the peninsula and brought their Indo-European languages with them. Sometime between 730 and 700 BCE, the ancient Greek poet Hesiod wrote the Theogony, a description of the origins and genealogies of the Greek gods. In the Theogony, we see one of the earliest references to the Etruscans, who are called Ticenians. It reads, "And Circe, the daughter of Helios, Hyperion's son, loved steadfast Odysseus, and bore Agrius and Latinus, who was faultless and strong. Also she brought forth Telegonus by the will of golden Aphrodite, and they ruled over the famous Ticenians very far off in a recess of the Holy Islands." So this tells us that the Etruscans lived in central Italy and were ruled by a king with mythical origins, but it still doesn't tell us where they came from. During the 5th century, the famous Greek historian and geographer Herodotus wrote that a group of Lydians from western Anatolia, forced by famine, had left the Aegean and migrated to central Italy. There they stopped referring to themselves as Lydians and changed their name to Tyrrhenians after the king's son who had led them there, Terensos. However, the Greek historian and logographer Xanthus of Lydia wasn't aware of this connection and likely would have been if it was in the histories of his hometown. This fact was pointed out by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who, as I just said, favoured a native origin for the Etruscans. It's also notable that the language of the Lydians was Indo-European, whereas the Etruscan language was not. Helianicus of Lesbos was convinced that the Tyrrhenians, and remember that Tyrrhenian was sometimes used for the Etruscans as well as other non-Greek people, were the Pelasgians who had supposedly migrated from Thessaly, Greece. Classical Greek writers use the term Pelasgian to describe a more ancient pre-Greek people from the Aegean, and they were often associated with the Thessaly region. Another idea was that the Etruscans were the legendary sea peoples, written about in Egyptian inscriptions. These sea peoples supposedly comprised several different groups, including the Teresh, the Shurdan, and the Peliset. This connection is based on the tenuous link between the names Teresh and Tyrrhenian, although there's nothing else really that associates the two. The Athenian historian and general Thucydides also thought that the Etruscans were Pelasgian migrants and that they had been pirates who travelled from the island of Lemnos. There's an interesting linguistic connection here because the Etruscan language has only been partially deciphered, but it is similar to inscriptions found on the island of Lemnos. Some scholars have grouped Etruscan, Lemnian, and Rhaetic together. Rhaetic was spoken by the Rhaetian people who lived in the Alps. Both the Roman historian Livy and the Roman author Pliny the Elder thought that the Etruscans were related to these Rhaetian people. In the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, the Etruscans become pirates again. Presently there came swiftly over the sparkling sea Ticenian pirates on a well-decked ship, a miserable doom led them on. So as you can see, ancient writers, some of which were contemporary with the Etruscans, had pretty varied ideas about where they had come from, and they debated it too. What this tells us is that they were fascinating enough for people to write a lot about them. Over the years, scholars have published many books and papers on the Etruscan culture and have discussed its likely origin at length. The general consensus amongst archaeologists now is that the Etruscan culture was autochthonous, which means that the Etruscans were native to the Italian peninsula, and that their civilization had emerged out of the earlier Iron Age Villanovan culture around 900 BCE. The Etruscans shared certain similarities with the Villanovan culture, including the location of sites, advanced metalworking skills, and societal structures. A gradual evolution can be identified in the archaeological record. But what does the DNA say? Archaeogenetics is a useful way of looking at the origins of groups of people, especially when combined with archaeological, linguistic, and anthropological data. Several DNA studies over the years reached the same conclusion that I just discussed, that the Etruscans were native to the Italian peninsula. The most recent DNA study was published in 2021 in the journal Science Advances, and that's the one I want to talk about today. In this study, genomic analyses were carried out on 82 individuals spanning 2 millennia of Italian history and coming from archaeological sites in Tuscany, Lazio, and Basilicata. The earliest group, which dated to between 801 BCE and was labelled as Central Italy Etruscan, mostly formed a homogeneous genetic cluster. A large portion of the genetic profile of these individuals was similar to that of neighbouring contemporary groups, such as the Latins from Rome, and can be attributed to steppe-related ancestry. The steppe-related genetic component is thought to have arrived in central Italy as well as other European regions during the Bronze Age. This was the result of Yamnaya-related groups migrating westwards from roughly 2700 BCE. It's also thought that Indo-European languages first arrived in Europe at that time. 3 beaker complex-related individuals sequenced from northern Italy and dating to around 2000 BCE revealed that steppe-related ancestry was not yet widespread there 4,000 years ago. The earliest steppe-related ancestry found in central Italy dates to 1650 BCE. All of this suggests that the admixture process was ongoing on the Italian peninsula and increased over time. It's thought that Proto-Italic split with its descendant languages of Latin, Oscan, and Umbrian during the 2nd millennium BCE, which is around 1,000 years later than when Indo-European languages first arrived in Europe with steppe-related groups. So Italic likely reached the peninsula at a later date, which correlates with the spread of the steppe-related genetic component into the area. The authors of the paper discuss the linguistic persistence of Etruscan, a non-Indo-European language in central Italy, even though there was a genetic turnover of the population. They suggest that early Italic speakers may have been assimilated into the Etruscan language community during a period of admixture over the 2nd millennium BCE. Etruscan is considered to be a relict language like Basque, but it is not isolated since it's related to Rhaetic that was spoken in the Alps and Lemnian that was spoken on Lemnos in the Aegean. However, experts think that this language group, which has been labelled as Ticenian, could have arisen due to population movements out of Italy rather than the other way around. The earliest non-local genetic signature from the early samples dates to the 7th century BCE and has a Central European profile. This genetic profile overlaps with an individual dating to 400 years later, which implies that sporadic ancestry from north of the Alps had some level of continuity in central Italy. In the last 4 centuries of the 1st millennium BCE, more individuals in the sample have non-local genetic ancestries from the Near East and Northern Africa. This may have been due to the expansion of the Carthaginian Empire across the Mediterranean. In one tomb at San Germano in Vetulonia, a genetic transition was apparent between the 8th and 3rd centuries BCE, first shifting from local to Central European and then to North Africa. Essentially, the majority of the samples dating from 800 to 1 BCE, the time during which Etruria flourished and the Etruscans maintained their political autonomy, culture, and language, the genetic profiles showed large levels of continuity. The Etruscans were, just as with other neighbouring groups on the peninsula, autochthonous to Italy and derived from the earlier Iron Age Villanovan culture who had steppe-related ancestry. They shared this steppe-related ancestry with other Italic-speaking groups on the peninsula. The second sample, dating to between 1 and 500 CE, the Roman imperial and antique periods, showed a transition in the genetic profiles to Eastern Mediterranean influences. This shows that the activities of the Roman Empire were bringing an influx of people into the wider central Italian region rather than just Rome itself. Granting citizenship to more people, as well as the movements of slaves and soldiers, all likely played a role in population changes at that time. The third sample dated to the early Middle Ages, between 500 and 1000 CE. Here, the researchers identified a shift towards Northern European related ancestries, such as the Longobard culture. This coincides with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the establishment of the Longobard Kingdom. The researchers also identified population continuity between the early medieval and the present day in Tuscany, Lazio, and Basilicata, which shows that the modern-day gene pool originated a millennium ago. I find the topics of relict languages and language isolates fascinating. Even the evolution of English is interesting because it absorbs so many other languages into its vocabulary, and many words have changed meaning over time. I often think, where did that word come from? And then I look it up and I'm really surprised by what I read about it. The most recent one that shocked me was the word nice, which comes from the Latin nescius, meaning ignorant or unaware. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent. Let me know what you think about the Etruscans in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.